This is about the Invest HD trial. So it's really a pleasure for us to be able to host some of these webinars where trials are just in the phase of starting up. That's, of course, a very nice progress to be able to share with you, and also to see how we can collaborate together in the community to make this recruitment process as smooth and efficient as possible, and together make the results be realized as soon as possible, because we want to save time, and we think that a proactive community is the best way to achieve that. Also, we are quite a few people in the room, which is really, really nice. But it also means that we are too many to take a round of introduction, which I sometimes really like to do. But if you would share who you are, or who you represent, if you do that in the chat, that's always nice for others to see who you are, because I know that nobody knows everybody here in the room. But if we go to the agenda, you will be learning about the compounds of the Votoplam and how that was, came into this phase, and then about the Invest HD study. That's really the main topic for today. And then key takeaway summary, and then also there will be opportunities to discuss or to put questions in the chat, please. There may be questions that cannot be answered for different reasons, but we will do our best to respond to whatever comes up from you. And I think then we can just take it away. Beth Borowsky, welcome.
Thank you. And thank you, Astrid and the EHA, for inviting us here today to give an update on our program. And also thanks to all of you who have joined today, and to anyone who is watching this sometime in the future. So for those of you that don't know me, so I am the Senior Global Program Clinical Head at Novartis. I am overseeing the development of the Votoplam for HD program from the clinical perspective. So I'm a neuropharmacologist by training, which means that I like to study how the brain works and how drugs affect the brain. And I focused most of my career on neuropsychiatric and neurodegenerative diseases. And for the last 20 years, I've been working almost exclusively on Huntington's disease, and working towards the advancement of medicines that could slow HD progression. So I will turn it over to Asa now. Next slide.
Thank you. And thank you to Astrid and Ruth and EHA for inviting me to be here together with Beth from Novartis. And hello to everyone. I see several friends here. So I'm a scientist at Lund University in Sweden. I've been doing research on Huntington's disease for now almost 30 years. And I'm also a psychiatrist, and I run our HD clinic at the Skåne University Hospital in Lund, Sweden. And since a few years back, I also have the privilege of being deputy chair of the executive committee of the European HD Network.
Great. Thank you. Okay, so a few disclaimers here. The main one is that I am an employee of Novartis, but we can go to the next slide. Okay, so for those of you that are not very familiar with Novartis, I'd just like to share a little bit about who we are. So we are a large Swiss pharmaceutical company. We have over 80 years of experience in neuroscience, and we have a particular interest in rare genetic neurodegenerative diseases, as well as a history in Huntington's disease. So some of you may remember that a few years ago, we began a clinical development program for an investigational oral drug called branaplam. And while we were able to demonstrate that branaplam lowered levels of Huntington protein in people with Huntington's disease, we unfortunately ended up stopping the development of it due to safety concerns fairly early on. And we shared those findings with the HD community, to be transparent, but also to help other companies in their own development programs. And importantly, we continue to look for new opportunities to develop meaningful treatments for HD. So next slide, please. So I'm happy to say that we found that opportunity. So Votoplam is an oral Huntington lowering experimental therapeutic that Novartis is developing for HD. Now, it was originally developed by PTC Therapeutics under the name PTC 518. And Votoplam is the same exact compound. It's just now known as by its chemical name Votoplam instead of PTC 518, but same exact compound. So PTC Therapeutics first studied Votoplam in animal models, and then they did a phase 1 study in people without Huntington's disease. And then lastly, they did a phase 2 study in people with Huntington's disease. It was called Pivot HD. So then in late 2024, while this phase 2 study was still ongoing, Novartis decided to in-license Votoplam, and now we will be moving forward with the further development of it. And I'm happy to share that we've just started a phase 3 study called Invest-HD to further evaluate the safety and efficacy of Votoplam. Next slide, please. So we at Novartis, we really truly value input of the HD community. So as part of the process of developing our protocol for the phase 3 Invest-HD study, we held 2 patient advisory meetings, one with HD CAB and one with HD COPE. And what we heard over and over again was that the key unmet need for most people in the early stages of the disease was an intervention that could slow the further progression of the disease. We also heard a lot about the importance of making the trial accessible and less burdensome to people. And we've tried to incorporate much of that into our current trial as much as we can. Next slide, please. So before we talk about the new trial, I'd like to share a little bit about what we know so far about Votoplam. So Votoplam is an oral drug taken as a pill once a day at home. And what's important about that is that the treatment could be started and stopped if needed in the future. Now, a lot of people ask, well, how can an oral drug actually get into the brain? And what we know from animal studies is that if you give animals Votoplam orally, it not only gets into the brain, but it distributes all over the brain and then lowers Huntington protein in all parts of the brain. And this is important because there's a lot of different areas of the brain that are impacted by Huntington's disease. So having a drug that can spread throughout the brain and lower Huntington uniformly is a good start. So another good thing about a drug that is oral is that instead of only being able to measure Huntington lowering in spinal fluid by doing a spinal tap or lumbar puncture, we can also measure Huntington lowering in blood. So as you'll see, we do require some lumbar punctures in our phase 3 study, but not very frequently because we can also use blood samples to measure Huntington levels. Let's go to the next slide, please. Okay, so in order to understand how Votoplam works, it's important to first review some basic biology. So just bear with me for the next slide or two. So the brain contains billions of neurons, and proteins are the building blocks of those neurons. So where do these proteins come from? Well, each of us have our own unique DNA in our genes, and it's this DNA that instructs the body how to make proteins. But DNA can't do this directly. It has to first copy itself into this intermediate called messenger RNA or mRNA. And this mRNA then becomes the blueprint or recipe for how our bodies make proteins. So next slide. So following on this, as you know, HD is caused by a mutation in the Huntington gene or DNA, which then leads to a mutant form of the messenger RNA for Huntington, which then leads to a mutant form of the Huntington protein. So the mutation itself is the addition of extra CAG repeats in the Huntington gene, which leads to this abnormal elongation or expansion of the Huntington protein. And it's that elongated protein that becomes toxic to neurons. So people who inherit 40 or more of these CAG repeats will develop symptoms of Huntington's disease at some time during their life. And people who inherit 36 to 39 repeats might develop symptoms of Huntington's disease, or they might not. So if we go to the next slide, now we can look at how Votoplam works. But first, I need to explain one other thing. It's about mRNA. So mRNA starts off with these alternating pieces of information. These are known as introns and exons. So the exons contain the important information in the recipe for making proteins. And in the case of the Huntington mRNA, there are 67 of these alternating introns and exons. And during a process called transcription, all the introns get spliced out. You can think of it like editing a film clip, where you're cutting out all of the unimportant parts and then stringing together the important parts. So if you look at the top row here, you can see how normally intron 49 of the Huntington mRNA gets spliced out, just like all the other introns. And then exons 49 and 50 come together, and then you get a whole string of these exons together, and you can have a complete mRNA and make a protein. Now, on the bottom half here, you can see that what votoplam does is it tricks the body into thinking that intron 49 is actually an exon, and so it doesn't get spliced out. And this intron, number 49, which is now treated as an extra exon or sometimes called a pseudoexon, sends a signal to the body that, hey, it's time to stop. We're done here. We're going to degrade this mRNA. We're not going to make this protein. And that's how votoplam works. It's a Huntington mRNA splice modifier that lowers production of Huntington protein. So next slide, please. So this shows where we are to date with votoplam development. So as I said, PTC Therapeutics first did several preclinical studies in animals to look at the safety of PTC 518 or votoplam and its ability to lower Huntington in various parts of the brain. They then did a phase 1 study in healthy volunteers to explore multiple doses and to look at the safety in people. And then finally, they completed a phase 2 study called Pivot HD that evaluated the safety of votoplam in people with Huntington's disease and measured the ability of votoplam to do what it's supposed to do, lower Huntington protein levels. Now, the people that were in that phase 2 study are now being studied in a long-term extension that Novartis is overseeing. And finally, as I mentioned, Novartis has recently started a phase 3 study called Investigator that will evaluate the efficacy and safety of votoplam in a much larger population. So if we go to the next slide, before we talk about the phase 3 study, I'd just like to share a bit about the phase 2 pivot study. So this study included people that were genetically positive for the Huntington's disease mutation. They were at least 25 years old and were either in very early symptomatic stages of the disease or had mild functional decline. So 159 people were enrolled, and they were randomized to receive either placebo or 5 or 10 milligrams of votoplam. And this was given as a daily oral pill that they took at home. And then after 12 months, the participants were able to join another study called the long-term extension study, where those on votoplam stayed on their original dose, and those on placebo moved to either the 5 or the 10 milligram dose. So as I said, Novartis is now the sponsor of this study, and it will last for at least 48 months. And we'll continue to learn more about how people respond to votoplam in this study. So the next slide, last year we shared the findings of the 12-month Pivot HD study at a scientific conference. And we shared that the study met its 2 primary endpoints, safety and lowering of Huntington protein. So the study showed that votoplam lowered levels of mutant Huntington protein in both blood and CSF, demonstrating appropriate target engagement in keeping with its mechanism of action as a Huntington mRNA splice modifier. And importantly, the data supported moving ahead with a phase 3 study to gather more data regarding the efficacy and safety of votoplam. So we continue to evaluate the longer-term effects of votoplam in the ongoing long-term extension study. And we recently did what's called an interim analysis. So we did this when all patients in that study reached 12 months, which for the majority of people, that meant they'd been on votoplam continuously for 24 months. So the top-line data from that analysis also support the continued confidence in the safety profile of votoplam, as well as the design of our phase 3 study. And we're going to be sharing that data at an upcoming scientific conference. Next slide, please. And that leads us to where we are today. So we have recently started this phase 3 study of votoplam called InvestHD. We began enrolling participants in March of this year. And now it's my pleasure to turn it over to Dr. Petersén, who will talk a bit more about this new study.
Thank you. So the InvestHD is a phase 3 study, and it will test whether votoplam can slow the progression of Huntington's disease. And it's a large trial, so the company is inviting 770 people with Huntington's disease to take part. And so the study drug is votoplam, and it's an oral medication, and it's taken once daily with water at home. So pretty easy. So this is the design of the whole trial. And as you can see, it consists of 3 important parts. The first one is a screening. And in that part, the potential participant has to go to the clinic for several visits to see whether it is possible to participate in the trial, because all trials have inclusion criteria. And once they have been met, the person who will participate will be randomized to either votoplam or placebo. So nobody will know who's taking what. And so 60% of the participant will receive votoplam and 40% will receive placebo. And so this will last for 2 to 3 years. And it's a real commitment, both from people who are participating, but also the different study team as well as the company. And so in the protocol, it requires the participant to come in for clinical visits every 3 months. First 1 month after the start, and then every 3 months after that. Once the study is finished, there will be a possibility to participate in an open label extension. So independently of if a person got votoplam or placebo, it's at that time, it may be possible to then receive votoplam, and then participant will be followed after that. Next slide, please. And so here is some information about the eligibility criteria and assessments for the InvestHD trial. So this trial is slightly different from some of the other trials, because here people are invited to participate who are in very early stages of Huntington's disease. So what does that mean? Well, it could be that a person may not have a formal clinical diagnosis of Huntington's disease. In order to fulfill the criteria, one should have the regular job working at 100%, may not perceive any problems, or just have very mild symptoms. But when you come to your HD doctor who's participating in this trial, it should be possible to detect subtle changes in motor function or cognitive function when specific tests for HD motor problems or HD cognitive problems are assessed. So very early stage, but still some problems should be possible to measure using these specific scales. So both males and females are invited to participate, and one should have the age between 21 and 70 years. And what's important is to have had a genetic test where the CIG repeat is 40 or more in the Huntington's disease gene. When it comes to the study assessments, they have been chosen both to assess efficacy, looking at progression of Huntington's disease, but of course also very important safety measures. There will be CSF, this is a liquid from the brain and around the spinal cord that is taken through a lumbar puncture once a year, and then a bit more frequent blood and urine are collected, both for biomarker analysis to assess the efficacy on lowering Huntington levels, as well as safety markers. There are brain MRI scans made twice a year. And then are the typical clinical measures of Huntington's disease that are specific scales that are used to detect typical disturbances in motor function, as well as cognition, tests to assess functional capacity and independence. Then each participant will get a phone to do some digital tests. Will just not take a long time, but they are done at home once a week. And that's going to be also important data that's going to be assessed. And then participants will also answer questionnaires to determine some of the psychiatric symptoms that we know are really important in Huntington's disease, such as apathy and anxiety and depression, as well as, super importantly, quality of life. And then there will be different safety assessments made. Next slide, please. And so what does a participation in Invest HD involves? So as Beth mentioned, the company has paid close attention to make sure that these study visits are not too difficult for the participants, at the same time as they must meet all the regulatory requirements, and all the important assessments have to be made in order to see whether there are effects on disease progression. So the company has had different advisory board meetings with the patient groups like yourself in order to get the input from people with Huntington's disease about what's important to pay attention to. And so there will be a number of screening visits and health assessments. If you participate in this study, you have to take this oral medication every day, never forget, once daily at home, over 2 to 3 years. And then it's important to commit to these visits to the clinic that take place around every 3 months for 2 to 3 years. And so here there's been a balance in how long these visits have to be made, what kind of assessments are really important, and to make sure that the participants don't get too tired from these visits. So there's been a balance made here. And a typical visit will be between 3 to 5 hours. And they will then contain these biological tests, blood and urine, to look at biomarkers and Huntington levels, safety measures. And then there will be clinical and cognitive and motor assessments and these study questionnaires. And some of them it will be possible to split, so you can visit for 2 days if there are some more, like for example, when there's a lumbar puncture. And it's also possible to have a study companion with you for support, but you don't need to. And then there will be a follow-up assessment 1 month after the study completion, and that can be at the clinic or via the phone. And then after the treatment period is finished, participants will be, there may be possibilities to join the open label extension studies, and there all participants will then receive Votoplam.
Thank you, Asa. So before we go to questions, I just want to summarize some of the key messages that we conveyed today. So first, so Novartis is a company with a lot of experience in the rare neurodegenerative disease space, including Huntington's disease. And we think we are very well prepared to study Votoplam in HD. Second, there is accumulating data that supports the continued evaluation of Votoplam in this phase 3 study, and that the design of the study is set up in a way that will answer the important questions. And finally, the Invest HD study is now underway. It started recruiting in March of this year. And so we will be evaluating Votoplam as potential treatment for people with HD. And if we go to the next slide, thank you for your attention. For those of you that are interested in learning more about the study, you can actually click on this URL code. It'll take you directly to the clinicaltrials.gov landing page for the Invest study, or you can just go to clinicaltrials.gov or your registry of choice and just search for Invest HD or the study number that's there. But the QR code actually works really well. So that's it. So thanks so much for your attention, and I'll turn it back over to Astrid.
you said it, Beth. There is a huge interest actually being shown already, which is really nice, and we need it. So I think the other questions that is left, time is up. We have actually already responded to them, and you will see this recording will be placed on our website soon. I mean, it may take a week or two, but we will make it available as soon as possible. And also, you can go to the European Trial Finder webpage. Maybe Ruth, you can put it in the chat. If you want to pay attention and see, because we will publish there as soon as we have the information about when new sites and countries initiate the trial in Europe, and then in the United States they have. I'm sure the HSA has their site, and then you have the public ones as well. So stay tuned, and thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate your time. Both Beth and Åsa, thank you so much for sharing, and such a easy way to understand you. Honestly, it's been great to be here, and for the engagement from all of you in the room. So thank you, and have a nice evening.
Thanks for inviting us.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.